Non innamoratevi mai delle idee. Never fall in love with ideas. Learn to unlearn. My job as an educator isn't to teach anything, it's to unteach. So, everything, this is why I was telling you, everything that can be learned must, in some way, also be unlearned or at least questioned.
Hospitality isn't just about welcoming, it's about choices, mistakes, people, numbers, and divisions. Here, we talk with people who really do this job.
Questo è Tasto9.
This is Button 9, your direct line to hospitality. Hi Simone, welcome to Button 9, your direct line to hospitality. Thanks for accepting the invitation.
Thank you.
I'm really glad to have you here because I need to tell you a couple of things before we start this journey together. This journey through your personal and professional life. Before I started my own company, when I was searching for inspiration, for trainers, for informers, and for people who spread knowledge. You know, when you start researching the tourism world and you're the speaker at the events I attended the most, no one else stands out.
Does that bother you a lot?
At all your events, or the events you took part in, I was always there, way in the back.
I have to apologize to you.
No, not at all. So when you accepted the invitation, I was really happy, and today I'm happy. I wanted to prepare as best as possible for this interview. I usually prepare 4 to 5 questions related to the guest's profession and vision. Today, however, I didn't prepare a damn thing. Nothing, but I work like this too. Why? You did a pre-interview that, in my opinion, is full of ideas. As I read it, my ideas exploded, my inspirations exploded, and everything. So I'll start and ask you questions related to your pre-interview, so it's easy for you.
Yeah, a meta interview. And
so now let's get started. Button 9. This new season is divided into 2 phases, the personal phase and the professional phase, which definitely intertwine in some way over time, but the common thread is we start from the beginning. We start with you introducing yourself and telling me about your journey from childhood to today. I'll jump in during the different stages of your life. I'll ask you some questions, and now I'll stop talking. Introduce yourself, Grad.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. First of all, my name is Simone, and I am currently 46 years old, so I am gradually getting closer and closer to that big half-century mark in my life. What exactly do you want to know about me? I mean, because there are so many versions of Simone.
You start. I'll interrupt you in a bit.
Okay. The spaceship that brought me to this planet landed in '79. I'm what they call a Xennial, so a mix between Gen Z and Gen X, which basically means absolutely without a purpose. Over the years, I've been interested in a lot of different things, especially when I was a kid. I got really into music, and as strange as it might sound, I was also into philosophy at a very young age. And then, through a wild game of mirrors, I ended up in this field totally against my will. Over the many passing years, I have successfully managed to bring back quite a few of the creative approaches I had utilized before ever entering this professional field, even integrating them deeply into what I do in my work every single day. It's like living many lives, and I'll tell you why. Partly for reasons of age, but also because I'm basically schizophrenic. So honestly, we're pretty much on the edge of being bipolar. So let's say it's very difficult. Maybe it's easier to explain it to you in eras. I mean, we should divide it into little...
So let's get on the spaceship. The first question I'd like to ask you is, what kind of family environment were you born into? And the lover of philosophy and music, when did Simone actually discover he loved philosophy? Was it as a child, as a teenager? I'll let you talk here as well.
I come from a very normal family, extremely working class. None of my parents do anything related to what I do. My mother was a housewife, my father worked for a company. In transportation, so absolutely. The first part of my life was really working class. And for me, as I was saying, the real revelation was music. It became a real obsession. Right away, I mean, I remember my earliest memories were of my father, who still is. He's a music lover, not obsessed like me, of course, but he used to put these vinyl records on the turntable. Now there's a bit of a vinyl revival, so I guess everyone knows what we're talking about. But back then, there were music formats that albums were pressed onto. And I remember it was truly a lightning bolt for me. I don't remember playing much with toys. I was always in front of the turntable. So I think that by the age of 6 or 7, I had listened to my dad's entire record collection, and he was really into it. Like 70s prog rock, that kind of stuff. And there was a little guitar at home that my dad used to strum. Not very well, honestly. And there's a photo that proves I picked it up, but I was maybe 3 years old. Something like that, and I strummed it a little and then threw it off the balcony. So that was really my first rock star move in life. I think I was about 3. So that was really a lightning bolt moment. It wasn't gradual at all. It was just like, okay, my whole world is going to revolve around this now. And that's still how I am today. You know, every day for the last 40 plus years of my life, one strict rule I never break is that every day I listen to an album I have never heard before. On top of all the other music.
Open.
I think statistically I'm probably one of the people who makes Spotify lose money because of how many hours I listen. We're talking about roughly 18 hours a day, so you can imagine that's really a lot. So this, I repeat, has truly been a passion and obsession though. My love for philosophy, on the other hand, started a little later. I got interested, again when I was very young, in reading, starting with horror, like many people from our generation who grew up in a context where Italian horror was really important. I remember that the first book I asked my father to buy me was a book by an author who might not mean much to you, but if I explain who he is, maybe you'll know. His name is Paolo di Orazio, and over the years, he actually became a dear friend. And he wrote this book called Primi Delitti, First Crimes. Paolo di Orazio is very well known in the field, both for this book and because he had this publishing house called Acme, which published Splatter and Mostri, which were 2 magazines. For us, let's say they were iconic of those years, the 80s, and also for being the drummer of Latte e i suoi derivati, which was Lelio and Greg's band. I remember that I bought this book, and that's when the second obsession began, the obsession with words. Over the years, as I said, being a good fanboy, around the age of 35 or 36, I managed to meet Paolo at one of his book presentations, and then we became friends, but I always say it's kind of your fault that I write so much and all that. And so, little by little, as I got more and more interested in words, in the end, I went through some more philosophical views on life. It was also the time, when horror started to take on philosophical connotations after the acronym and so on. And so then I enrolled in philosophy at university.
Quick break. If you're enjoying this episode, please leave me a comment, hit like, give it 5 stars. Basically, let me know you're listening and following along with this crazy story. And teenage Simone, who was caught between music and this immersive reading of horror, already had some dreams tucked away, already had some ideas about what he wanted to do when he grew up. Granted, even today, no one really knows what they want to do. But when you were younger, you already had some clear ideas, and you'd even had some experiences with the world of hospitality.
None at all. As a teenager, all I wanted to do was play punk rock. I just wanted to be... And even now, honestly, if you told me, look, tomorrow you can change everything, I'd be like, okay, let's start a punk band and spend forever jamming in basements. That was the only thing I ever wanted to do. Always. So, no, there was absolutely none of that. My teenage years were really just school and basements. So rehearsing, putting together demos and all that.
Your pre-interview is interesting. I want to ask you, you say, I feel like an antenna that picks up and amplifies possibilities. I know I'm jumping ahead in my line of questioning my journey, but I was really curious, so I put this first. A question for you. Why?
Because I don't think our individuality matters much. Honestly, what matters, I believe that ideas don't come from. My view in this respect is pretty, I don't want to say nihilistic, but let's say anti humanist, if you will. So I don't really think we matter much as individuals. What matters is always being attentive, being in the right rooms. I always say that if I find myself in the room where I'm the smartest person, then I'm in the wrong room. And above all, never say no to things. And this is something that sometimes gets me into trouble. Because, if after this interview you told me, hey, let's go fish for marlin for a week and not sleep for 20 days, I would always say yes to everything. I mean, I say yes to everything. So this is a compulsion that obviously comes at a cost. But this allows you to come into contact with a range of viewpoints that are often completely opposite to your own. And if you do this long enough, in my opinion, you reach the final stage of enlightenment, which is having no point of view at all. So basically, you just act as an antenna and are able to take the best and the worst from people. Then, based on that, you use it in the various experiences of life. So let's say I've always had a tendency to be attentive, always, and without ever wanting to push my own opinion in any way. I'm someone who is very often in disagreement with myself, from many perspectives, being in disagreement with yourself. And
This being this way, this antenna that listens to every point of view, often doesn't have its own point of view because it's in disagreement with the previous point of view or in agreement with the point of view that's about to come. In your personal and professional life, how much does this affect you?
100%. Let's say one of the problems we have, there's a very interesting book by Sorovieschi. It's called The Wisdom of Crowds. And it says, if we put experts in a room, the top experts, you've been doing this podcast for a while now, right? Yes. Imagine, you take all the people you've interviewed and all the people you will interview. At some point, these people will start to have very similar views, simply because their thinking will become more and more alike. The only way to get out of this trap is, this is why I told you earlier that I only trust the inexperienced, to bring in someone who either doesn't come from this field or has nothing to do with the conversation. So in my opinion, the problem with being an expert leads to a herd mentality, which is very, very dangerous. Because it puts you in this completely misleading situation, where you think that if you've seen a problem before, the next time you encounter the same problem and are asked to solve it, you'll automatically want to solve it with the tools you used the previous time. And I assure you, this is one of their... In consulting, and I do a lot of consulting, this is one of the riskiest things you can do. So, you need to have a beginner's mindset, right here. Because if you flip a coin 100 times and it lands on heads 99 times, statistically, the next time it's not guaranteed that it will land on tails.
Okay. How has this impacted your clients? I look at the world of hospitality, I look at the world of consulting, and then we'll get to what you do today, what you're an expert in, a total lightning bolt. But many times I meet entrepreneurs and hoteliers who want a point of view, they want your opinion, and then they compare it with other opinions. So what kind of entrepreneurs and hoteliers are we talking about? Because being specialized in the hospitality sector and also in the tech world, which is quite diverse, how do you deal with them?
Let me make it clear that this is actually the main problem. I mean, if they're asking me for an opinion, or if they're trying to form an opinion, they're on the wrong track. In my opinion, the only way to keep a business healthy is not to have opinions, not to fall in love with ideas, and above all, not to focus on learning, which is what I mentioned to you earlier, off camera earlier. Of course. In my latest book I write, this is not an instruction manual, but a manual of destruction. And I truly believe that. I believe that anything that can be explained isn't worth learning. Simply because you have to be completely open. So in this case, the evaluation is mostly about something else. What do the data say? So when someone asks me something, I say I absolutely have no opinion. Let's see what the numbers tell us. Based on that, we start making a series of hypotheses, using a scientific approach, and these hypotheses will most likely be wrong. We set a KPI, which obviously changes from client to client, If this KPI is met, that's good, but it's definitely not thanks to me. Like I said, it's simply due to what happens here. This conversation definitely gives me the chance to see things differently. Tomorrow. So, obviously, you have to take a leap of faith. The client who works with me knows they're working with a consultant who's a bit crazy.
A nutcase.
Yeah, in fact, often they're a bit crazy too. And I'll close this parenthesis of questions to get back on track with our journey. And let's return to you choosing philosophy at university. And from there, how did your path evolve? So I enrolled in literature and philosophy. And even back then, my main interest was, I'm talking about quite a few years ago. We're talking about the late 90s. I was mainly interested in the relationship between human beings and machines, so everything related to the work of philosophers like Gunther Anders, who wrote a lot on the subject, about Promethean shame, but also going as far as more physical aspects, you know? So kind of the Ballardian idea of human-machine hybridization, transhumanism, and so on, before it was even a thing. Because, like I said, we're talking about the 90s. This was my main interest. As I mentioned, I came from a very working-class family. We went through a pretty rough time when my father suffered a major financial failure, so we had to sell our house and so on. So to support myself at university, well, I managed somehow. I basically had 7 or 8 jobs. One of the jobs I did was, since, thanks to all the records I had listened to, I spoke pretty well by then. English, which I had basically learned from the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, I decided a job that wouldn't be too hard could be working as a night porter. That would give me a lot of time, because there really wouldn't be much to do, and I could study what I loved. Gunther Anders, and so on, but there really wouldn't be much to do. We're talking about 99. Here, I guess. A hotel operated and managed by Trappist monks, a professional business enterprise, and it is truly and remarkably so in every respect. Pen and paper? So let's say light years away from technology. This was a problem for me, though, because I realized that, for example, this is true, they didn't have a PMS. What they did was take 4 A3 sheets, tape them together, and start planning. This meant it was a ton of work. I mean, every time you had to change a room or change a charge on those 4 A3 sheets, believe me, it's complicated. So at the end of the night, I said, well, if I spend 7 hours on this sheet, I just will not have time to study. So I wrote a proto-PMS in 99. Look, let's use this not because I want to improve your life somehow, but because I basically want to improve mine. Otherwise, I just can't find time to study. And so let's say that was the point of contact. The general manager. He was so amazed by this thing, which was really very, very, very homemade, that he then asked me to work during the day, which didn't work for me because I already had 2 other jobs and I was going to class in the morning. So I was completely sleep deprived. So let's say that helped quite a bit. But in the end, I accepted. And so I started living an even more hectic life because I worked during the day, and since I'm a workaholic, I was working like 16 hours a day, then going to class and so on. And I remember that one of the problems I had at university was with this aesthetics professor, which is a part of philosophy that's actually pretty complex, a bit abstract. And during an exam, I remember every time I had to get time off from work, so for me, it was just about taking the exam and going home. I'd go back to the hotel, and he showed up an hour and a half late, you know? The academic elitism of the 1990s, university was pretty much like that back then. And I told him, look, I have to take this exam. There are like 100 check-ins after me. And he said something that really stuck with me. He told me, if you need to work to pay for university, don't come to university. I was just stunned. I won't even tell you how it ended. It ended badly. I left university that day with a perfect 3 average. So basically, all I would have to do is re-enroll, write my thesis, and I'd be done. And I decided that I would never set foot in a university again, unless it was on the other side, as a professor, which actually happened, but with a bit more human understanding of what university students face, who often have stories, which aren't everyone's stories. So let's say at that stage there simply wasn't any university anymore, and so I started with my little career. It was starting to work in corn at like 28 years old. I was the GM of a small group of diners. I repeat, zero. Talent is I'm just obsessive. So there's one thing, I do the word endlessly, and so this was my beginning. Then he died. This teacher. And then I decided that sooner or later I'll go back and get this degree. I actually asked for it ad honorem, but they won't give it to me yet. Let's see.
Okay. That
I could have GPT write the thesis, because honestly, that's the only thing missing.
It took me 10 years to graduate, so I get you. No, but I'd like to open another small parenthesis. You went from philosophy to writing a proto-PMS in a hotel working the night shift. I'm missing a time gap here, your relationship with technology.
Come on, I was a nerd.
So where did it come from? What were the inputs? And these friars gave you access to a computer, since everything else was paper and pen. Where did you find this computer?
Well, actually, my love for technology also comes from music, because as I said with my father, mostly it was rock from the 1970s, so a lot of Procol Harum, Jimi Hendrix, Carlos Santana, Pink Floyd, and so on. But things changed for me. The first time I listened to a band, you might not know them, called Kraftwerk, which is a German electronic group, called krautrock, basically. And the first time I listened to it, to me, it was truly alien music. Where are these sounds coming from? I was only used to guitar, bass, and drums, Moog. But then these sounds came in, and so I started getting more and more interested in technology through music. So I started reading a lot about synthesizers and so on, and from there I moved on to computers, because those were the years of the first personal computers, the Commodore 64 and so on, the Commodore Amiga, which was an extremely advanced tool for its time. And so, through music. So I basically used it to synthesize sounds. And then I started getting interested in technology as well, especially in video games. So actually what I was doing was, on this computer I had installed a bunch of video games, and at night, every now and then, I would play. There was this computer, but it was almost never used. I think it had arrived thanks to some funding. No one used this computer. I was the only one who used it, and that's where I started writing this proto, PMS. Technology also became a huge obsession for me.
At 28 years old, let's say it has been quite a long time since your beloved professor passed away so unexpectedly.
No, the professor died. He passed away recently.
Okay, so at 28 years old, you work in a hotel, in a department, but it can be identified. Has the switch already happened in your life that takes you to the other side of the hotel, or do you keep working in these establishments for a few more years? What do you do?
Now, so I work in the corn business, and then shortly after. Instead, I get hired by this small 4-star hotel in Rome, which was going through a rebranding, and I come in as the general manager. But we're talking about a very small property. From there, I start trying to figure out what, in my opinion, wasn't working. We're talking about the Via Nazionale area in Rome. So imagine an area where statistically, there's the highest number and concentration of rooms. So the competition is huge. And in those years, all these properties looked alike. They were really just copy and paste. And I started to make a series of assessments. Again, since I was passionate about data, as I mentioned, I realized that many of the people staying there were Americans, with children, teenagers, or preteens. What came to mind was to buy a bunch of gaming consoles for all the family rooms and to offer a welcome voucher, a drink for all the parents. So basically what would happen is that they would go to the bar and the kids could play completely freely with free games. And this, of course, made the bar's ancillary revenue skyrocket. So I also started to use it a bit as a sales lever. Following that successful transition, the ambitious owner managed to effectively double the hotel's total annual revenue within just the first year of operation. And as a direct result of this financial success, he began seriously considering the possibility of a small expansion. Consequently, he decided to take over an entire additional floor of a nearby building to accommodate more guests. At the time, it was one of the offices, and on this floor, he started thinking about this hotel. In his mind, he wanted to create another sort of 4-star hotel. I had a different idea because I realized there was a gap at the time, which was the emergence of the first wellness hotels. I said, let's make a boutique hotel with a small spa in every room, and we'll sell it at a price point that's 3 times higher than the local average. And he was crazy enough to get me. He gave me the green light, and it actually became a bit of a success story. In fact, I think now there are 6 or 7 hotels under the same brand. And so that's how it went.
A bit later on, during the course of our interview, you actually wrote something very poignant to me. I simply couldn't bear to look at myself in the mirror anymore. You were still working in hotels, probably at a different property. Tell me about this, because you reached a point in your life where, because of your job, you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror anymore. In a way, you became more human, a little less crazy. And in my opinion, this is where you come back down to earth. You go back to being human, to being Simone. Why? What happened?
So there are 2 different steps, though. The first is when I left hospitality, the operational side of hospitality. And that was, let's say I was very interested in everything related to data, everything related to the product, everything related to the brand. But I'm really not good at dealing with people. I'll tell you, I can do small talk, but let's say I'm great at short conversations. But if you spend a week with me, in the end, we'll end up in total entropy. So just imagine what it was like for me to talk to guests. It was really complicated talking to the staff. It was really complicated, and I remember that was something I would have loved to be able to handle. But it just wasn't my thing. It wasn't in my wheelhouse. I remember I left the operational hospitality one night. I think I was 30, maybe? New Year's Eve. And for the first time in my life, I decided to spend New Year's Eve out. When you work in a hotel, it's always New Year's Eve for you anyway. For me, the idea of a New Year's Eve party was kind of esoteric. I remember I organized everything down to the smallest detail until just a few minutes before. And I said, look guys, I'm not in Rome anyway, I'm going to a friend's house. We're out. If there's a problem, call me, but it'll be hard for me to come back. I get to my friend's house. The night porter doesn't show up and sends a doctor's note. And I call all the other guys. If anyone had wanted to cover that shift, obviously paid like 5 times what we would have paid for that day, I couldn't get in touch with anyone. They were really young guys, so it's understandable. I get it. And in the end, the only person who agreed to cover the shift was a maintenance guy who unfortunately didn't speak English. So what happened that night while everyone else was out celebrating? I was on the phone with the maintenance guy, doing checkouts over the phone. Remotely, let's say, and I told myself, this doesn't add any value. It's not that I'm incapable of doing this, but you see people... Anyway, then somehow they staged a mutiny, so maybe I could work better in a more consulting-oriented environment. And that's when I came into contact with a French-American consulting firm where I worked for several years. And that's where I finally came to the conclusion. I just couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. Because even though the job was truly a dream job, since I did consulting, I think, for some of the most beautiful establishments in the world, the problem was that at a certain point, my team, each of my account managers, was consulting for about 100 establishments. I started doing the math, and I said, 100 establishments. Imagine consulting, French-American style. So we're not talking about costs, not the Italian fees, just one client in consulting. A client could pay 15 to 20,000 euros for a month of consulting, excluding bits. And just a quick calculation. At the time, I was living in Paris, so imagine the 35-hour work week. There was no way around it. And doing the math, you realize that if you have 100 clients and a 35-hour work week, that's 140 hours. All it takes is for one person not to show up for work. Someone takes a day off, or the metro is late one day. But basically, these clients were paying $15,000 to $20,000 a month for 20 to 30 minutes of consulting per month. Which, ethically, for me, it was complicated. So I decided to leave with a lot of second thoughts. because I had shares in the company, which was later sold for several million. So I would have gotten several million from the exit, but I just couldn't do it anymore. I didn't want my face to be associated with that kind of consulting anymore. And so I decided to move into a different environment, to open my own consulting firm, which is extremely boutique. So I have very few clients, super selective, to whom I dedicate a lot of time, and who can really ask me for anything. Maybe I wrote this to you before. You go from the client who tell you, do you think it's more appropriate to have a mix of cloud, LLM, and machine learning to do this project for the client who says, it's not working for me? The printer. So let's say this is what I want to do. Would you say you can identify this as the turning point in your professional life? Yes, absolutely. But is Simone a man? So during those years working in hotels with 8,000 guests, up until that New Year's Eve, how did he experience it? How did he feel? Well, honestly, pretty good, basically. Because I am who I am, I'm passionate about doing things. No, so for me, as long as you manage to achieve a result, it didn't necessarily have to be financial. For me, for example, the best project I did in hospitality as an operator was creating a brand. So there wasn't a lot of friction. I simply think that at a certain point, the switch was more about understanding my own limits. And this is something I don't know how to do. Maybe I'm more suited to doing something else. And for me, I repeat, it was always very important that my actions had an effect that went beyond just affecting myself. So what's the impact on the customer? What's the impact on the organization? And so on. This has always been extremely important to me. Let's say an ethical approach toward the customer. At work, and so as a man, let's say I was tired, obviously, but physically tired. But for that reason, I would say it was, all things considered, a happy period. You open your boutique agency. What goals do you have? Bringing well-being to my clients, not just financial well-being, has always been extremely important to me. And one thing I learned when I was working for that other agency was that I never really bought into it. This kind of approach is that somehow consulting was supposed to be almost esoteric, so the end client wasn't supposed to understand the reasons behind some of your choices. And I think this also created a bit of a fallacy, where the client thought that without you, they wouldn't be able to understand certain dynamics. For me, it has always been important to also take on the role of an educator for my clients, to explain to you the reason why certain choices were made, often even counterintuitive ones, and why we are doing this. So my approach has always been to try to create well-being, obviously financial well-being for my clients, but also to create a sort of anchor that would allow them to get answers to complex questions, answers that weren't just fluff, or that weren't driven by economic or commercial motivations. I have a client retention rate of almost 100%. I think the only client I ever lost is one I fired myself, because I didn't agree with the way he treated his employees ethically. So I have clients who have been with me for 15 years, basically even before I had the boutique, clients who came over from the other company. To the point that sometimes I even say, after 15 years, why don't you find another consultant? What else can I tell you? Of course. But very often their response, their reason is, with you, I understand what's going on. Or at least I understand the direction. If there's one thing I know how to do, it's to get a sense of where things are headed. Sure, maybe the details are always a bit hazy, but more or less the direction is what matters. And so for me, that's always been the driving force. Now, let me go back to Simone for a moment. Trainer, educator, science communicator, academic, let's say university lecturer. I'd like to touch on another topic, young people.
Now, you probably meet quite a few of them. I'd like to hear your perspective on these young people, on their approach. Actually, you'd be better at telling me this. In your field of study, whether it's towards technology or the tourism world. So I'd like you to talk to me about this, since you meet so many of them. Tell me, give me your point of view on this.
What of you? That's a good question. I'm sorry, but I have to make a lot of side notes when you ask me this.
Question. I'm very open-minded.
Again, I think another problem we have is thinking in generational terms. A generation is a chronological concept, not an intellectual one. So when I hear, for example, oversimplifications about how Gen Z behaves, how Gen Alpha behaves, how boomers behave, these are stereotypes, which in some cases can be helpful because it allows us to put people into boxes. But as I said before, when you put people into boxes, they're no longer people. So in my opinion, it's a risky approach. So with young people, even if they might belong to the same generational cohort, you still encounter very different approaches. So a 20-year-old, do you have a 20-year-old? Gen Z, Jal, Alphas and Boomers, at the same time, in the same class? Absolutely. So I wouldn't make it so much of a generational issue, I'd make it a little bit. It's a bit of a UI problem, and now this might surprise you, what I'm about to tell you, but I'm convinced that the central problem of understanding technology today lies in interfaces. Let me give you an example. I'm older than you, obviously. For us, technology enthusiasts, being able to do something, to make a machine do something, required at least a minimum understanding of the machine. All right. As a kid, I decided to take this BASIC course, a programming course in BASIC. And I remember, for example, on a Commodore 64, even something as simple as printing a page still required a line of code, an input that had to be given. So what we understood was that for every computer output, there had to be an input. And this input had to be formatted in a way that, thank you, the machine can understand.
And in the language of the machine, right?
In the language of the machine. So you have to learn that language, right? You might learn it while stumbling along, you know? Maybe you speak a kind of broken French, and that's fine, but you still learn it more or less. The problem, in my opinion, starts when graphical interfaces lower the complexity. So while for us, even from a philosophical point of view, we simply knew that an output corresponded to an input, and that input had to be formulated in a certain way. Today, simply, and let's say this is after the iPhone, just to give you a bit of a chronological reference, most technology users who use it critically, they simply know that if they press a button, something happens, but they have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. So the paradox, in my opinion, is that when I talk to someone in their 20s, unless they're a nerd, they know nothing about technology. Nothing at all. It's just that they've lived in a world where the user interface is so simple that basically anyone can use it. I can't say it, or maybe I can tell you the author since I think it's coming out anyway. Luca. Do you know Luca Vescovi from Neuromark from John Pett?
What?
Okay, he wrote a really great book about cognitive pollution in children. I have a 5-year-old son, so just imagine. I felt particularly called out, and I wrote a small chapter for this book that I provocatively titled, "Your Child is a Monkey, and so is Mine." And my assessment is that if you give a tablet to an orangutan, it will be able to use it after a while. That's because the graphical interface is so simple that it doesn't require any real understanding. So I start from that point, saying, be careful when you see your kids fiddling with technology and think they're good at it. How many times have you, maybe, I don't know if you have, I have a nephew who's really great with technology. No, because if you give it to a monkey, that monkey will do the same thing. It's not that he's amazing, it's that Steve Jobs was amazing at building an interface that even an orangutan can use. Okay, so there's this switch. So if I talk, paradoxically, with someone from my generation who has kept up with technology, I skip over you. You interviewed Davide Berlusconi. He's the perfect example. He's a total nerd, and he can break down the essence of technology for you. Today, it's a bit harder with young people, because if they're not interested, they don't have to go through that learning curve. So I always say, do you want to give your kids computers? Give them a 386. You want them to play a video game? Have them play Golden Axe or Bubble Bubble. Put them in front of complexity. That's the starting point of technology. The problem is that, as I was saying, in the same class you find the orangutan, so to speak. In other words, the one who uses technology only because they're dealing with a very, very simple user interface. And then you have the much more advanced user. But they're in the same group. I mean, they're all in their 20s. And the real skill, in my opinion, and I'm not sure I have it myself, is being able to teach heart to heart, differently from person to person. overcoming the fallacy that one generation should be treated differently from another. Adorno, sorry if I always go off on a philosophical tangent, but in my opinion, he was wrong. So we haven't really moved toward massification. In some way, we've gone toward hyper-personalization. You can see it even in advertising. We've gone from mass marketing to niche marketing to one-to-one marketing, and now to quanti marketing. To the human being, basically. I do marketing to you, I do marketing to Simone, I do marketing to Emilio, I do marketing to Davide, and so on. So thinking in terms of boxes, not only does it not exist in nature, as I was saying, but in my opinion, it's also very risky for what we do, both as educators and as consultants.
Would you give these young people today any advice?
Yes, never fall in love with your ideas. Learn to unlearn. My job as an educator isn't to teach anything, it's to unteach. So this is why I was telling you, everything that can be learned must in some way also be unlearned, or at least questioned. The problem we often have, and it's not a generational problem with young people, it's a problem with the university system, is that they come in and they've studied maybe from books from the 90s or 2000s, written by people who are completely disconnected from what's actually happening. In our field, in the technology sector, they come in with dogmas, because maybe they come from, well, I teach at EPFL in Lausanne. Tuition there is 250,000 francs every year. So just imagine, when you come in with that kind of education, maybe you think, okay, I've got technology in my pocket. But the first thing you need to do is walk out of here completely humbled. I mean, you need to realize that everything you know doesn't count for anything. I mean, it has to be torn down, or at the very least, it always needs to be reconsidered, always questioned. It's not easy. I made a post about it on LinkedIn. Recently, a girl at a school where I teach complained to the dean about my class, saying, "This lesson actually destroyed everything I learned in 5 years at this school." Let's say with all the glitz and so on. So it really felt respectful to me that he told me these things don't work anymore. This girl wanted it to be explained to her. For example, how do you create a campaign on Facebook when we know, for instance, that there are now generative AI tools that can create it with us? By 2026, that's probably how it'll be. So that knowledge used to be necessary, but today it's only necessary from a historical perspective. So, okay, my point is always the same. I can teach it to you from a historical perspective, but it's more or less like teaching you how to do fax marketing. Is that really important for you? Take it, carry it with you, but a lot of what we do is no longer applicable. I know my job is on borrowed time, and you have to accept that critically when you want to give an opinion in some way. So let's go back to that. You fall in love with the idea, and the moment you fall in love with the idea, you're no longer objective. The moment you're no longer objective, you're useless. Thanks. You make a lot of pauses. I don't know if I'm telling you things that are too crazy.
No, I am completely and utterly captivated by your words, and I express my deepest gratitude to you, because right now I am overflowing with an incredible sense of joy for the beautiful way and the perfect timing of it all. And what are you sharing here? On button 9?
Obviously, this applies to me too, so everything I say should always be questioned. I'm the first to say that.
I think we've reached the end, though I'm reluctant because I still have a few more things I'd like to ask you, but then they tell me we always go on too long. And the long-winded speech on button 9. No one listens to it all the way through. I look at the stats, so... And I thank you. I thank you for being who you are, on behalf of someone passionate about the tourism world, truly the embodiment of hospitality. I thank you for bringing it every day, and for dedicating those 7 hours in the morning to figuring out what tomorrow will bring, or to figuring out how to revolutionize in your own small way, and then on a larger scale, the world of hospitality. And thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. See you next time, and thanks for making it this far, and for listening to the whole episode of Tasto9. Now, if you're listening to us on Spotify, please don't forget, click the little bell and leave us 5 stars. If you're watching us on YouTube, no worries. Just click the button, follow, and leave me a comment. Thank you. See you in the next episode.